Welcome to Blurr, where history's most chilling trials unfold through voice and imagination. Tonight, we step back into the shadowed courtrooms of the 19th century, where a case gripped an entire nation and whispers of guilt echoed far beyond the walls of justice. The Trial of Thomas Courvoisier is a story wrapped in mystery, tension, and the weight of a verdict that would shock society. Before the truth emerges, listen closely, because every trial hides more than it first reveals. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from Blurr. Park Lane in the spring of 1840 was one of the most fashionable addresses in London, a broad street running along the eastern edge of Hyde Park, where the great houses of the aristocracy and the wealthy stood behind their iron railings, with the quiet authority of money and position securely held. To live on or immediately adjacent to Park Lane was to occupy a particular altitude in the geography of English social life, high enough to look down with complete confidence on almost everyone else, and sufficiently established to take that altitude entirely for granted. The houses were substantial, their interiors furnished with the accumulation of several generations of careful acquisition, and their staffs were maintained with the precision that the comfortable classes considered both a practical necessity and a mark of proper self-respect. Number 14, Norfolk Street, just off Park Lane, was the London residence of William Horatio Russell, Baron Russell of Killowen, known in the social world of his day simply as Lord William Russell. He was 73 years old in the spring of 1840, the younger brother of the 6th Duke of Bedford, a man of impeccable lineage and comfortable means, whose life had been lived across the full span of what his generation considered civilization. He had been a member of Parliament, had moved in the highest social circles, and had maintained through his long life the relationships and the habits of a man who had never had serious reason to doubt his own position or to entertain any significant anxiety about his safety. Lord William was, by the spring of 1840, an elderly widower living in the reduced style that age and moderate, rather than enormous wealth imposed. He maintained a household staff of 3, a lady's maid named Sarah Manser, a cook named Mary Hennell, and a manservant who had been employed since February of that year, a young Swiss man of 23 named François Benjamin Courvoisier. The household was quiet, regular, and entirely typical of its kind. The old lord kept early hours, had his routine, received his visitors, and conducted his life with the orderly predictability that age and long habit produce. On the morning of May 6, 1840, that orderly predictability was shattered. Lord William Russell was found dead in his bed, his throat cut with a violence that had nearly severed his head from his body. The room was in disorder. Various items of value appeared to be missing, though the disorder would later prove to be somewhat artificial, the staging of a robbery rather than the evidence of one. And in the household at 14 Norfolk Street, the morning routines of the remaining servants were proceeding with a composure that, under the circumstances, would itself become a subject of investigation. The murder of Lord William Russell was not, in the statistical sense, an unusual crime for early Victorian London, where violent crime was common enough to generate a regular supply of material for the newspapers. What made it extraordinary, what made it the sensation of its year, and one of the most discussed criminal cases of the entire Victorian era, was the combination of the victim's social position, the circumstances of the crime, and the ultimate revelations about who had committed it and why. The Courvoisier case, as it became known, raised questions about the nature of domestic service, about the relationship between masters and servants, about the reliability of professional advocates, and about the ethics of criminal defense that Victorian Britain found deeply disturbing and that resonate in various forms to the present day. Chapter 2. The Victim and His World. William Horatio Russell had been born in 1767, the second son of the 4th Duke of Bedford, and he had lived a life shaped by the peculiar combination of privilege and relative constraint that characterized the younger sons of the great aristocratic houses d'État. He was not himself a duke, and the wealth and position that attached to the dukedom were his brother's rather than his own. but his birth connected him to the highest levels of English society in a way that gave him access to every drawing room and club that the world of the 1840s considered significant. He had served as a soldier in his younger years, reaching the rank of general, and had sat in Parliament as member for various constituencies over the course of several decades. He had been married and had children, and his family connections were extensive and distinguished. By 1840, he was an old man in the final chapter of a long and socially comfortable life, maintaining his London house and his routine with the assistance of his small staff and the occasional company of family and friends. His character, as described by those who knew him, was that of a man of the old school, somewhat irascible in manner, not especially generous to those in his service, demanding of the attention and deference that his position expected, but not a man of any particular cruelty or exceptional meanness. He was, in short, a typical English aristocrat of his generation, formed by the assumptions and habits of a world in which the distance between the gentry and their servants was so fundamental and so ancient that it was barely noticed, let alone questioned. His manservant Courvoisier had been with him for only about 2 months when the murder occurred. François Courvoisier had come to England from Switzerland, where he had been born in the canton of Vaud in 1816, and had worked in various domestic capacities in London before obtaining the position with Lord William through the standard channels of law channels, recommendation, and character reference. He was described by those who had known him before the crime as a young man of agreeable manner, competent in his duties, and not obviously given to the kind of difficulties that made servants problematic. The relationship between Lord William and Courvoisier in the 2 months of their association had, apparently, deteriorated somewhat. There is evidence that Lord William had expressed dissatisfaction with Courvoisier's performance on several occasions, and the possibility that Courvoisier had reason to fear dismissal was one that the subsequent investigation would examine carefully. Whether this, combined with whatever other pressures and desires animated the young man's actions, was sufficient to explain what happened in the early hours of May 6th, is one of the questions that the case both answered and left permanently open. Chapter 3. The Discovery and the Investigation. The morning of May 6, 1840, began at 14 Norfolk Street with the normal routines of a London household. Sarah Manser, the lady's maid, rose at her usual time and began her morning duties. She went to Lord William's room to open the shutters, as was her custom, and discovered that something was wrong. The room was disordered. Lord William was in his bed, apparently still. When she went closer, she found him dead, his throat cut in a manner so severe that the wound had nearly decapitated him. The bedclothes were soaked with blood. The violence of what had been done was extreme. Manser immediately raised the alarm. Courvoisier was in the house, and he was among the first to respond to the commotion. He presented himself, in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, with a composure that some observers found unremarkable, and others found, in retrospect, slightly too steady for the circumstances. He helped to manage the immediate situation, sent for the police, and conducted himself, outwardly at least, as a distressed but capable servant dealing with an emergency. The police arrived promptly, as they generally did in cases involving the households of the aristocracy. Inspector Nicholas Pierce and other officers from the Metropolitan Police, which had been established only 11 years earlier by Robert Peel, and was still developing the investigative practices that would later become standard, examined the scene. With the thoroughness that the case demanded, they noted the disordered state of the room, the missing items, and the position of the body. They interviewed the servants, and they began to form impressions that would shape the direction of the investigation. The disorder in Lord William's room appeared, to experienced eyes, to be somewhat artificial. Items had been moved, drawers opened, objects displaced, but the pattern of disruption was not quite consistent with the kind of frenzied search that a genuine burglar might have conducted. The missing items were relatively few and relatively selective. The locks on the doors showed no signs of forced entry, and the nature of the wound, the deep, deliberate cut of a throat with a sharp blade, spoke to someone who had approached the sleeping victim at close quarters and killed with a directness that suggested either great nerve or great familiarity with woe. The victim's vulnerability. The investigation moved quickly through the servants and through the question of who had access to the house. Various neighbors and passers-by were questioned. The possibility of an outside intruder was examined and found wanting. The evidence pointed, almost from the beginning, towards someone inside the household. And within that small household of 3 servants, the evidence would narrow with increasing rapidity toward the young Swiss manservant who had been in Lord William's employ for only 2 months. Chapter 4. The evidence accumulates. The investigation of the Russell murder was, by the standards of 1840, and by the standards of a police force that was still in its institutional adolescence, reasonably thorough and ultimately effective. The evidence against Courvoisier accumulated through a combination of physical investigation, careful examination of the household's routines, and eventually a discovery that transformed a strong circumstantial case into something considerably more decisive. The physical evidence at the scene was examined with the care that the gravity of the case demanded. The weapon, a razor-sharp knife or similar blade, was not immediately found at the scene, which suggested premeditation and the deliberate removal of the instrument. The wound itself was consistent with being inflicted by a person of Courvoisier's height and physical capacity. The blood distribution suggested that Lord William had been killed while sleeping or immediately upon waking, before he had any opportunity to resist or to call for help. The question of access was central. The house had been locked for the night by Courvoisier himself, as was standard practice. The lock showed no signs of interference. The windows were not disturbed in any way that suggested entry or exit from outside. An intruder who had entered the house, killed Lord William, partially ransacked the room, and departed without leaving any trace of entry or exit, while the household slept, was a possibility that the police examined without finding any evidence to support it. The accumulating weight of the physical evidence pointed toward an inside job, toward someone who lived in the house and who had access to Lord William's room during the night. Among the servants, Manser and Hannell had alibis of a kind. They had slept in their rooms on the upper floors. They had heard nothing suspicious during the night, and the physical evidence of their rooms and persons showed nothing that connected them to the crime. Courvoisier's room and person were also examined, and initially, nothing was found. But the investigation did not stop there. In the days following the murder, a systematic search of the house and its outbuildings was conducted. Behind a piece of paneling in one of the lower rooms, investigators found a collection of items that had been missing from Lord William's room: small pieces of jewelry, a small amount of cash, and other portable valuables that the apparent burglar had supposedly taken. The location of these items, hidden within the house rather than removed from it, was deeply significant. A genuine burglar would have taken the stolen items away. These items had been hidden inside the house by someone who lived there and who had expected, perhaps, to retrieve them later, or whose plans for disposing of them had been interrupted by the speed of the investigation. The finding of the hidden items effectively destroyed the possibility that the murder had been committed by an outside intruder. It also focused attention decisively on Courvoisier, whose duties would have given him knowledge of and access to the areas of the house where the hiding place was found. Combined with the physical evidence, the absence of forced entry, and the character of the wound, this discovery made the case against Courvoisier compelling. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Lord William Russell. Chapter 5. The hotel evidence. There was a further strand of evidence that the prosecution would develop at trial, one that addressed not only the immediate circumstances of the murder, but also the question of Courvoisier's state of mind and his prior conduct in the weeks before the killing. This evidence concerned his behavior at a hotel in Leicester Square, where some of his activities had come to the attention of the management, and it would prove in the context of the trial to be among the most damaging elements of the case against him. In the weeks before the murder, Courvoisier used his position in Lord William's household to obtain various items belonging to his employer, items that he had then deposited at a hotel in Leicester Square, operated by a French family named Piolaine. The items included a quantity of plate and other valuables. Courvoisier had asked the hotel to keep these items for him, presenting them in a manner that did not immediately raise questions. though the Piolanes would later recall that there had been something about the transaction that had struck them as slightly unusual. When the murder became public knowledge and the police investigation began, the Piolanes recognized the name of the murdered man's servant in the newspaper accounts and made the connection with the valuables that had been deposited at their hotel. They came forward to the police. The items were recovered. They were identified as belonging to Lord William Russell, and the evidence of Courvoisier's prior theft from his employer, apparently conducted over some period before the murder, provided both a motive for the killing and a prior history of criminal conduct that the prosecution would use to devastating effect. The motive that the hotel evidence established was not straightforwardly simple. Courvoisier had been stealing from Lord William before the murder. If Lord William had discovered the theft, or if Courvoisier had feared that he was about to be discovered, the murder could have been motivated by the desire to prevent exposure of the earlier thefts rather than, or in addition to, any more premeditated desire for gain. This would explain the somewhat disorganized appearance of the crime scene, the apparent staging of a robbery that had certain inauthentic qualities, and the hiding of the stolen items within the house rather than their removal. It would also explain something about the timing and the manner of the killing. A man who kills to prevent discovery of an earlier crime is acting under a different set of pressures than a man who kills in the course of a premeditated robbery, and the specific character of his actions might reflect those different pressures. Whether the murder was premeditated in the fullest sense, whether Courvoisier had planned to kill Lord William in advance, or whether the killing was a more immediate response to a perceived threat of discovery, was a question that the evidence allowed but did not compel the jury to decide. What it clearly established was that Courvoisier had stolen from his employer, that Lord William had been murdered, and that the totality of the evidence pointed to Courvoisier as the murderer. Chapter 6. The Bar and the Bench. The trial of François Benjamin Courvoisier opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in June 1840, before the Recorder of London, Sir Nicholas Conyngham Tyndall, who was also Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and who presided over the fatwa proceedings with the authority that his double distinction warranted. It was one of the most anticipated criminal trials of the year, and the courtroom and the streets around the Old Bailey were crowded from the earliest hours of the morning. For the prosecution, the Crown was represented by John Adolphus and William Webb Follett. Follett was one of the most distinguished advocates of his day, a man of great forensic skill and considerable personal charm, whose career at the bar had already established him as one of the leading counsel in England. He was, in the context of this particular case, dealing with a prosecution that was, in its outlines, straightforward. The evidence against Courvoisier being strong and the main challenge being to present it in a manner that left the jury with no reasonable doubt about the verdict. For the defense, Courvoisier was represented by Charles Phillips, a barrister of Irish origin and considerable reputation who had built his career largely in the civil courts, but who was also experienced in criminal work and known for the eloquence and emotional power of his advocacy. Phillips was not, by the accounts of his contemporaries, a lawyer of the analytical precision and intellectual rigor that the greatest English advocates possessed, but he had a gift for moving juries through the force of his rhetoric and the warmth of his personal appeal, and these were qualities that could, in the right case, compensate for a deficit of evidential strength. The presiding judge was Mr. Baron Park, Baron Sir James Park, one of the most respected figures on the English bench, known for his precise legal learning, his even judicial temperament, and his unwillingness to allow either prosecution or defense to step outside the proper boundaries of their respective roles. He was a man who took the rules of the adversarial system seriously, who believed in the proper separation between the functions of advocate and judge, and who would be called upon in the course of this trial to navigate one of the most difficult ethical situations that those rules had ever presented. The jury was sworn. The court settled into the particular concentrated attention that a capital trial generated, an attention sharpened by the knowledge that the proceedings, if they concluded with a guilty verdict, would end with a man's death. The question of guilt or innocence was, in this case, not one about which any thoughtful observer had great uncertainty. The question that would make the Courvoisier case permanently significant was a different one altogether. Chapter 7. The prosecution's case. The prosecution's presentation of the evidence against Courvoisier was methodical, comprehensive, and by the standards of the case entirely adequate to the task. John Adolphus and Webb Follett took the jury through the evidence in a sequence that built, piece by careful piece, the argument for Courvoisier's guilt. They began with the circumstances of the discovery. Sarah Manser gave her account of finding Lord William's body, of the disordered room, of calling for help. She described Courvoisier's demeanor in the immediate aftermath, noting its steadiness without making it the occasion for any accusation. Mary Hannell corroborated the account of the morning and added her own observations about the state of the house and the behavior of the household in the days before the murder. The police witnesses described the crime scene in detail: the wound, the disorder, the locked doors, the absence of any sign of outside entry. Inspector Pierce and his colleagues gave their assessment of what the physical evidence indicated, and their conclusion that the murder had been committed by someone inside the house was presented with the professional authority that their systematic examination warranted. The prosecution then walked the jury through the discovery of the hidden items behind the paneling, explaining in detail where they had been found and what that location implied about who had hidden them. The hotel evidence was presented through the Piolanes, who described Courvoisier's deposit of the items and their decision to contact the police when they recognized his name in the newspaper reports. The items recovered from the hotel were identified as belonging to Lord William, connecting Courvoisier directly to the theft of his employer's property, and through that connection, to the broader picture of his conduct in the weeks before the murder. Forensic evidence of the period was limited by comparison with what is available today, but the medical witnesses who testified about the wound were able to describe its characteristics, its severity, and the force and precision with which it had been inflicted in terms that were consistent with the prosecution's account of the killing. The wound was not the result of a struggle. It was a deliberate, directed cut of great force, inflicted upon a sleeping or unconscious man by someone standing very close to him in the darkness. The prosecution rested its case with confidence. The evidence was strong, the witnesses were credible, and the inference from the totality of what had been presented was clear and compelling. Courvoisier had stolen from his employer. His employer had probably discovered the theft or was about to do so. Courvoisier had killed Lord William in circumstances that pointed to him with near certainty. The hidden items confirmed that the apparent robbery was a staged deception, and the absence of any credible alternative suspect or scenario left the jury with one conclusion available to them. Chapter 8. The defense begins. Charles Phillips opened the defense with the rhetorical force and emotional appeal that were his professional signatures. He addressed the jury in terms that emphasized the gravity of the proceeding, the terrible finality of a capital verdict, and the corresponding obligation that the jury bore to be absolutely certain before returning a verdict that would send a man to his death. He spoke of the presumption of innocence, of the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, and of the danger of convicting on the strength of circumstantial evidence, however apparently compelling. He challenged the prosecution's evidence on several fronts. He pressed the absence of any direct evidence linking Courvoisier to the killing, noting that no witness had seen him commit the crime, and that the weapon had not been found. He suggested that the disorder of the crime scene might be consistent with a genuine intruder, that the hidden items might have been placed there by someone seeking to frame Courvoisier, and that the hotel evidence, while damaging, did not itself constitute proof of murder. He cross-examined the prosecution's witnesses with the intention of finding inconsistencies and uncertainties in their accounts. Manser was questioned about her movements during the night and about the precise nature of her observations that morning. The police witnesses were pressed on the conclusions they had drawn from the physical evidence and on the alternative explanations they had or had not considered. The Piolanes were questioned about the precise circumstances of Courvoisier's deposit at the hotel and about whether they had, in fact, any reason to be suspicious at the time. The defense's problem was that the prosecution's evidence, while circumstantial, was genuinely strong, and the alternative theories that Phillips was offering were genuinely weak. The intruder theory required the jury to accept a series of improbabilities: no forced entry, no trace, a deliberately staged scene, items hidden in the house, a perfect crime committed by an unknown person with no identified motive. These improbabilities, stacked one upon another, did not add up to a reasonable doubt. They added up to a desperate argument. And then, partway through the trial, something happened that transformed the Courvoisier case from a murder trial of notable interest into one of the most discussed legal and ethical controversies in the history of the English bar. Something happened that placed Charles Phillips in a position that the rules of professional conduct, as they were then understood, and as they would come to be understood afterward, had never clearly addressed, and that forced him to make a choice whose implications would be debated for generations. Chapter 9. The Confession. During the course of the trial, and specifically at a point when the prosecution's case had been substantially laid out, and when the defense was managing its response, Courvoisier confessed to his counsel that he had, in fact, murdered Lord William Russell. He told Charles Phillips the truth. He had killed his employer. He had cut the old man's throat in the night, staged the disorder to make it appear a robbery, hidden the stolen items in the house, and conducted himself throughout the investigation with the composure of a man who believed he could escape detection. This confession placed Phillips in a position of extraordinary professional and moral difficulty. His client had confessed to him privately. The confession was covered by the absolute privilege of legal professional confidentiality, which meant that Phillips could not reveal it to anyone without his client's consent. He could not go to the judge, he could not go to the prosecution, and he could not go to the police. The confession was his, and his client's alone. But he had been defending Courvoisier on the basis that he was innocent, or at least that the prosecution had not proved him guilty. He had been cross-examining witnesses who were, as he now knew, telling the truth. He had been arguing for an acquittal of a man who had told him he was guilty of the most serious crime imaginable. What was he to do? The question that Courvoisier's confession posed to Phillips, and through him to the entire English legal profession, was one of the most fundamental in the philosophy of criminal defense. The adversarial system of justice depends on the principle that every accused person is entitled to the best possible defense that a competent advocate can provide, regardless of whether the advocate believes or knows the accused to be guilty. This principle rests on the deeper conviction that the determination of guilt is the function of the jury, not the advocate, and that the jury can only perform that function properly if the accused's case has been presented with the full skill and commitment that professional representation entails. But the principle has limits. An advocate cannot knowingly present false evidence to a court. An advocate cannot suborn perjury. An advocate cannot make positive assertions of fact that the advocate knows to be false. These prohibitions exist because they are necessary for the integrity of the process that the adversarial system is supposed to constitute. Without them, the advocate becomes not the defender of the accused within a system of justice, but an agent of deception against the system itself. Chapter 10. Phillips's Dilemma and His Decision. Charles Phillips consulted with his colleagues about the impossible position which Courvoisier's confession had placed him. The consultation was discreet, as the confidentiality of the communication required, but it was genuine. He needed guidance, and the guidance he received reflected the genuine uncertainty about what the rules required in circumstances that had, apparently, not been clearly addressed before. The conclusion that Phillips reached, and that he acted upon in the remainder of the trial, was that he could continue to represent Courvoisier, but that he must do so within the strict limits that professional honesty imposed. He could not make positive assertions of Courvoisier's innocence. He could not argue, as counsel sometimes did, that the accused did not commit the crime, but he could continue to hold the prosecution to its burden of proof. He could continue to challenge the reliability of the evidence. He could continue to present the case in the most favorable light available, while stopping short of the specific assertions that he knew to be false. What Phillips actually did in the remainder of the trial, and whether he adhered to this distinction in practice, became a matter of intense subsequent controversy. His closing address to the jury, delivered after Courvoisier had confessed to him, was by all accounts a powerful and eloquent piece of advocacy that pressed the reasonable doubt argument with considerable force, and that, in the view of some observers, crossed the line between legitimate challenge to the prosecution's proof and the implicit assertion of innocence that his knowledge precluded him from making. The ethics of what Phillips did in that closing address were debated for decades after the trial, and they have been debated in various forms ever since. The core of the dispute is whether a lawyer who knows his client to be guilty can, consistent with the duty of professional honesty, continue to address a jury in terms that are calculated to produce an acquittal. The distinction between challenging the prosecution's proof and implying the accused's innocence is a distinction that is relatively clear in principle and extremely difficult to maintain in practice, because the entire structure of an advocate's closing address to a jury in a criminal case is directed toward a single practical goal: the acquittal of the accused. Every argument, however framed, is in service of that goal, and the effect of the advocacy is the same whether the advocate frames it as a challenge to proof or as an assertion of innocence. The controversy was sharpened considerably by what happened after the verdict. Courvoisier was convicted and subsequently confessed publicly before his execution. In his public confession, he named Phillips as having known of his guilt during the trial. Whether Phillips's conduct had been technically within the rules or not, the public disclosure that his advocate had known him to be guilty while continuing to defend him was received with considerable disquiet, and it generated a public debate about the ethics of criminal defense that the legal profession found both necessary and uncomfortable to engage with. Chapter 11. The jury's verdict. The jury in the Courvoisier case deliberated and returned a verdict of guilt. The outcome was not surprising. The evidence had been strong, the defense had been unable to mount a convincing alternative account, and the jury had the benefit of Mr. Baron Park's careful and balanced summing up, which had laid out the evidence and the applicable law with the precision and fairness that characterized his judicial performance. The deliberations were not extended, and the verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Courvoisier received the sentence of death with the composure that had characterized his conduct throughout. He had, in his own way, been remarkable in the trial. He had sat through the proceedings, heard the evidence presented against him, heard his own counsel argue for his acquittal, and maintained throughout a demeanor that those who observed him described variously as calm, cold, and apparently unmoved. Whether this composure reflected genuine equanimity, a belief that the verdict might go the other way, or simply the particular deadening of feeling that extreme circumstances can produce, is not something that the record allows us to determine. The judge's sentence was the expected one: death by hanging. The machinery of Victorian capital punishment moved quickly in cases where guilt was clear and conviction had been obtained, and Courvoisier's execution was set for a date in early July. There was no significant public campaign for clemency, no diplomatic intervention of the kind that the Maybrick case would later generate, and no serious legal challenge to the conviction or the sentence. The case had been tried properly, the evidence had been compelling, and the verdict was one that the public and the legal establishment alike regarded as correct. What the public and the legal establishment did not yet fully understand was that the trial had raised a question about legal ethics that would prove considerably more durable and considerably more difficult than the question of Courvoisier's guilt. The question of what Charles Phillips had known and when he had known it, and of what he had done with that knowledge in the conduct of his client's defense, would become one of the central cases in the developing jurisprudence of legal professional ethics, and it would be discussed, cited, and argued about long after Courvoisier himself had been forgotten by all but the most dedicated students of legal history. Chapter 12. The Execution and the Confession. François Benjamin Courvoisier was executed on July 6, 1840, outside Newgate Prison, before one of the largest crowds that London had assembled for a public execution in many years. The execution attracted enormous public interest for several reasons. The case itself had been widely followed. The condemned man was young, foreign, and by his own subsequent account, guilty of a premeditated murder committed against an elderly and helpless victim. And the execution was attended, among the tens of thousands who gathered, by several individuals whose presence contributed to the event's cultural significance. One of those present in the crowd was William Makepeace Thackeray, the novelist, who had attended with a friend and who was sufficiently disturbed by what he witnessed that he subsequently wrote about it in a celebrated essay titled "Going to See a Man Hanged," published later the same year. Thackeray's account of the execution is one of the most vivid and most honest pieces of writing about capital punishment that the Victorian period produced. He described the crowd, the atmosphere, the spectacle of the hanging, and his own reaction to it with a clarity and a discomfort that made the essay an important document in the long Victorian debate about the morality and the efficacy of public execution. Execution, also present, or at least claimed to have been present, was a young Charles Dickens, who would later become one of the most vocal opponents of public executions, and whose fictional treatments of crime and punishment would both reflect and influence the public debate about these issues for decades. The presence of two of the most significant English novelists of the century at the execution of Courvoisier is a detail that literary historians have found compelling, and that speaks to the particular intensity of public fascination that the case generated. Before his execution, Courvoisier made a confession that was consistent with the evidence and that confirmed the prosecution's theory of the case in its essential outline. He had stolen from Lord William over a period of time. He had feared that his thefts were about to be discovered. He had gone to Lord William's room in the night and cut his throat with a carving knife that he had hidden in the pantry for the purpose. He had then staged the apparent robbery, replaced the knife, and hidden the stolen items in the hope of recovering them later. In his confession, Courvoisier also addressed the question of his lawyer's knowledge, stating that he had told Phillips of his guilt during the trial. This part of the confession immediately created a secondary controversy that in some ways outlasted the primary story of the murder itself. The legal profession was placed in the uncomfortable position of having to address publicly and formally the question of what a lawyer may do when a client confesses guilt during trial, and the answers that various members of the profession offered were not uniform, were not entirely satisfying, and were not accepted as final resolutions of a genuinely difficult question. Chapter 13. The Ethics of Criminal Defense. The controversy generated by Charles Phillips's conduct in the Courvoisier trial was, in the context of Victorian legal culture, genuinely unprecedented in its public character and its professional reach. The question of what an advocate may do when his client confesses guilt during trial was not one that had been addressed in any systematic way by the formal rules of the bar or by the leading cases on professional conduct. The Courvoisier case forced the profession to confront it, and the confrontation was difficult and revealing. The most important voice in the subsequent debate was that of Lord Brougham, the former Lord Chancellor, who had himself been involved in famous criminal defenses, and who had, in an earlier case, articulated what became known as the Brougham principle. The idea that an advocate's duty to his client is so absolute that, in the discharge of that duty, the advocate knows but one person in the world, and that person is the client. This principle, stated in its most extreme form, seemed to imply that the advocate was permitted, perhaps even required, to do whatever was necessary for the client's acquittal, regardless of what the advocate personally knew or believed. The Brougham principle was understood by many in the profession to support what Phillips had done. If the duty to the client was paramount, then continuing to represent Courvoisier, continuing to challenge the prosecution's proof, and continuing to address the jury in terms favorable to the defense was precisely what that duty required. The advocate's personal knowledge of guilt was, on this view, irrelevant. It was the jury's function to determine guilt, and as long as the prosecution had not proved its case to the required standard, the advocate's duty was to argue against conviction. But the opposing view was that the Brougham principle, however broadly stated, did not and could not, extend to conduct that involved the advocate in active deception of the court. The purpose of the adversarial system was not to secure acquittals for guilty defendants, but to provide a mechanism through which the truth could be determined by subjecting the prosecution's case to the most rigorous possible challenge. If the advocate knew the accused to be guilty and continued to address the jury in terms calculated to produce an acquittal, the advocate was not challenging the prosecution's proof in the spirit of the adversarial system. The advocate was exploiting that system for a purpose the system was not designed to serve. This debate was not resolved by the Courvoisier case, and it has not been resolved since. The rules of professional conduct that govern barristers in England and Wales today address the question with more specificity than was available in 1840, providing that an advocate who receives a confession of guilt from a client may continue to represent the client, but must limit their advocacy to challenging the prosecution's proof, and must not make positive assertions of innocence or call evidence that the advocate knows to be false. This formulation captures something of the distinction that Phillips himself claimed to be observing, but its application in practice remains genuinely difficult, and the debate about whether any advocate can truly maintain that distinction under distinction. Pressures of a capital trial continues in the academic literature and in the professional conversations of practicing lawyers. Chapter 14. Thackeray, Dickens, and the Public Execution Debate. The presence of Thackeray and Dickens at Courvoisier's execution, and the writings that emerged from their experiences, placed the case at the center of one of the most important public debates of the mid-Victorian period, the debate of whether capital punishment, and specifically its public character, was morally defensible and socially beneficial. Thackeray's essay Going to See a Man Hanged is a document of unusual honesty and self-awareness. He had gone to the execution partly out of curiosity, partly out of a professional interest in human experience, and partly, he admits, with a kind of morbid excitement that the occasion generated and that he found in retrospect deeply disturbing. What he witnessed, and what disturbed him most deeply, was not the execution itself, though that was harrowing, but the behavior of the crowd. The festive atmosphere, the drinking, the jostling, the laughter, the complete absence of the solemnity that the occasion supposedly demanded, these were things that made him profoundly uncomfortable, and that led him to question whether the spectacle of public execution achieved any of the deterrent or moral purposes that its defenders claimed for it. He described Courvoisier's demeanor on the scaffold, with attention to the human reality of what he was witnessing. A young man about to die, his composure remarkable, his manner neither heroic nor abject, but simply present in the final moments of his existence. The description is devoid of moralizing about Courvoisier's crime, focused instead on the act of killing that the state was performing and on the public's participation in that act as spectators. Thackeray's conclusion was that he had come away from the execution feeling degraded and ashamed, not of Courvoisier, but of himself and of the society that had made what he had witnessed possible and normal. Dickens, who would address the question of public executions in subsequent years through both journalism and fiction, shared much of Thackeray's discomfort, though his engagement with the issue was expressed differently and over a longer period. His novels, particularly those dealing with criminal justice, reflected a sustained attention to the ways in which the public spectacle of punishment shaped public attitudes toward crime and toward the humanity of those who committed it. The execution of Courvoisier was, for Dickens, one of several experiences that contributed to a deepening opposition to public hanging that he would eventually express directly and forcefully in correspondence with the Times and in public campaigns. The broader debate about public execution that the Courvoisier case contributed to was eventually resolved, in England, by the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, which abolished public executions and required that hangings take place within prison walls. The process by which public opinion moved to this position was long and complicated, but the accounts of observers like Thackeray and Dickens, testifying from their own experience to the moral debasement that public execution produced, were part of the evidence on which that shift in opinion rested. Chapter 15. the servant and the master. The Courvoisier case illuminates, with unusual clarity, the particular dynamics of the relationship between domestic servants and their employers in Victorian England, a relationship that was one of the most numerically significant social arrangements of the period and that generated its own distinctive set of tensions, vulnerabilities, and possibilities for harm. Domestic service in 1840 employed a very large proportion of the working population of England and was, for many young men and women from rural backgrounds or from immigrant communities, one of the principal available routes to urban employment and a kind of social stability. The conditions of domestic service varied enormously, from the relatively comfortable positions in great houses with their structured hierarchies and their established traditions, to the more precarious situations of servants in smaller households, where the isolation of the servant in an unfamiliar environment, dependent on the goodwill of an employer whose authority was essentially absolute, created conditions of considerable vulnerability. Courvoisier's position in Lord William's household exemplified several of the tensions inherent in domestic service. He was young, foreign, in a country and a city that were not his own, with no independent social network and no independent means. His entire situation depended on the goodwill of an employer who was, by some accounts, increasingly dissatisfied with his performance. The power relationship between them was entirely asymmetric. Lord William could dismiss Courvoisier at will, with potentially devastating consequences for the young man's economic situation and social standing. Courvoisier had no corresponding power over Lord William. The theft that preceded the murder can be understood, at least in part, as an attempt by Courvoisier to accumulate resources that would provide some independence from his dependence on Lord William's goodwill. The logic of the theft was the logic of someone who understands his own vulnerability and is seeking, through illegitimate means, to reduce it. The murder, which followed from the fear of discovery, was the escalation of that logic to its most extreme point, the elimination of the one person who could expose and destroy him. This pattern of petty theft escalating to violence when discovery threatens was not unique to the Courvoisier case. It appeared in various forms across the Victorian record of criminal cases involving domestic servants, and it reflected a structural reality of the master-servant relationship that the Victorian social order preferred not to examine directly. The relationship created incentives for dishonesty by combining extreme power disparity with the servant's constant proximity to the employer's property, and it created the conditions for violence by making the consequences of discovery potentially catastrophic for the servant. Chapter 16. The reliability of circumstantial evidence. The Courvoisier case is frequently cited in discussions of circumstantial evidence and of the standards of proof appropriate to capital cases, and it deserves some careful attention from this perspective, because the evidence against Courvoisier was almost entirely circumstantial and yet was, as the outcome confirmed, entirely accurate. There was no eyewitness to the murder. There was no confession at trial. The weapon was not found at the scene. The physical evidence was entirely indirect. The locked doors, the stage disorder, the hidden items, the pattern of the wound. The hotel evidence was damaging but did not directly prove murder. Hare's testimony in the Burke and Hare case 2 years earlier had been the direct account of an eyewitness participant. The prosecution in the Courvoisier case had no such resource. Everything they had was inference from circumstance. And yet the inference from circumstance was, in this case, entirely reliable. The jury's conclusion that Courvoisier had murdered Lord William was correct, as his confession confirmed. The circumstantial case had pointed accurately to the truth. This is, of course, exactly what good circumstantial evidence is supposed to do, and the Courvoisier case is therefore, from one perspective, an advertisement for the reliability of careful circumstantial reasoning. But it is also, and simultaneously, an example of why the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt matters so much in capital cases. The evidence against Courvoisier was strong. It was ultimately correct. But it was not impossible to imagine, before the confession, an alternative innocent explanation for at least some of it. A genuinely innocent servant in Courvoisier's position who had stolen from his employer but had not murdered him, might have found himself confronted with much of the same circumstantial evidence that was deployed against Courvoisier. The theft, the hidden items, the hotel deposit, these would all have been explicable without murder, and the murder itself would have remained unaccounted for by any evidence pointing to a different perpetrator. The lesson that legal scholars draw from cases like Courvoisier is not that circumstantial evidence is unreliable, but that its reliability depends entirely on the quality of the reasoning that connects it to the inference it is supposed to support, and that the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt provides an essential check against the danger of convicting on the basis of inference that seems compelling, but that could, on a different set of facts, point in a wrong direction. In this case, the inference was correct. In other cases, equally carefully reasoned from equally carefully assembled circumstantial evidence, it has not been. Chapter 17. The Metropolitan Police in 1840. The Courvoisier case occurred only 11 years after the establishment of the Metropolitan Police by Sir Robert Peel in 1829, and it provides an interesting snapshot of the investigative capacity and procedures of the early London police force. Well, the investigation, conducted under the pressure of a high-profile murder with considerable social and political significance, was in many ways impressive, particularly in its systematic approach to the physical evidence and in the thoroughness which it excluded alternative suspects before focusing on Courvoisier. The Metropolitan Police of 1840 was still in the process of developing the investigative practices and forensic capabilities that would characterize later Victorian policing. There was no detective department as such. The Criminal Investigation Department would not be formally established until 1842, and the officers who investigated the Russell murder were doing so using methods that were largely based on common sense, careful observation, and the kind of systematic questioning of witnesses and examination of physical evidence that any competent investigator, regardless of formal training, might have pursued. The discovery of the hidden items behind the paneling was a crucial investigative success, and it was achieved through thorough physical search rather than through any sophisticated forensic technique. The connections made between Courvoisier and the hotel evidence depended on the Piolanes' voluntary cooperation and their alertness in connecting what they had seen with what they read in the newspapers. These were the kinds of evidence gathering that the police of the period could do well when the circumstances were favorable. What the investigation could not do, and what the modern investigator might have been able to do differently, was to develop more direct physical evidence linking Courvoisier to the act of killing. The weapon was never recovered. The blood evidence that would today be the subject of sophisticated analysis was in 1840 simply noted as present. The absence of a confession until after the verdict meant that the case went to trial on circumstantial evidence alone, relying on the jury's willingness to draw the inference that the facts collectively supported. The Courvoisier case was one of several high-profile investigations in the early 1840s that contributed to the argument for a more specialized detective capability within the Metropolitan Police, and the establishment of the Detective Department 2 years after the trial can be seen, in part, as a response to the lessons that cases like this had taught about the limitations of general duty police officers as investigators of serious crime. The development of detective policing in Victorian England is a story with many inputs, but the experience of investigating cases like the Russell murder, where the evidential trail required careful and sustained specialist attention, was one of the most important. Chapter 18. Victorian Attitudes to Foreign Servants. One aspect of the Courvoisier case that has received less attention than its legal and ethical dimensions is the significance of Courvoisier's nationality and the way in which his foreignness shaped the reception of the case in Victorian Britain. He was Swiss, an employee in an English household, and a murderer. The combination of these facts activated a set of anxieties about foreignness and domestic service that were present in Victorian culture, and that the case helped to crystallize and articulate. Victorian Britain employed significant numbers of foreign servants, particularly in households that had continental connections, that wished to maintain a French-speaking environment for children being raised bilingually, or that simply found that foreign servants, particularly those from Switzerland and France, had acquired skills in continental domestic service that English servants sometimes lacked. The employment of foreign servants was a mark of a certain kind of sophistication and cosmopolitanism in the household that employed them, and it was not uncommon in the households of the aristocracy and the upper professional classes. But the employment of foreign servants also generated anxieties that were specific to their foreignness. A foreign servant was someone whose background could not be checked through the established English networks of character reference and social connection. A foreign servant was someone whose true character and habits were, to at least some degree, opaque to their employer in a way that the character of an English servant from a known background might not be. And a foreign servant was someone who owed no particular loyalty to English social norms and English social institutions, whose relationship to the employer was purely contractual, in a way that the idealized relationship between English master and English servant was supposed to transcend. The Courvoisier case fed into these anxieties by providing a vivid and terrible example of the worst that a foreign servant might do. The newspapers that covered the case did not generally dwell on Courvoisier's nationality in a way that was explicitly xenophobic, but the fact of his foreignness was present in the coverage and contributed to the framing of the case as one that raised particular questions about the risks of employing servants from outside the country. Whether this contributed to any practical change in the employment practices of Victorian households is difficult to determine, but the cultural residue of the case's association between foreign service and domestic danger was real and lasted for some time. Chapter 19. The Case in Legal History. The Trial of Thomas Courvoisier, as the case is conventionally titled, despite the fact that François was his first name, occupies a specific and significant place in the history of English criminal law and of English legal professional ethics. Its significance operates on several levels, each of which has contributed to its enduring presence in the legal literature. At the level of substantive criminal law, the case is relatively straightforward. It was a murder trial in which the evidence was circumstantial but compelling, in which a skilled defense was unable to overcome the weight of that evidence, and in which the verdict was correct. It contributed to the developing practice of circumstantial evidence reasoning in the early Victorian period, though it did not establish any new legal principles in this area. What it illustrated, powerfully and publicly, was the capacity of a well-assembled circumstantial case to produce a reliable verdict, and it was cited for this proposition in subsequent discussions of the standard of proof and the permissible use of the standard of proof. Inferential reasoning. At the level of legal professional ethics, the case is considerably more significant and considerably more complex. The disclosure of Charles Phillips's private knowledge of his client's guilt, and the subsequent public debate about the propriety of his continued advocacy, generated the first sustained public and professional examination of the ethics of criminal defense in circumstances where the advocate's private knowledge conflicted with the advocate's public role. The debate was not resolved by the case, and it has not been resolved since, but the terms in which it is conducted, the distinction between challenging proof and asserting innocence, the absolute character of confidentiality, the limits of that confidentiality, were all defined with a clarity that they had not previously possessed, and the Courvoisier case is the point at which that clarification began. The rules that now govern English barristers' conduct in situations analogous to Phillips's are more specific than anything that existed in 1840, and they reflect, directly and indirectly, the lessons that the profession drew from the Courvoisier controversy. The principle that a barrister may continue to represent a client who has confessed guilt during trial, subject to the limitation that the barrister may not make positive assertions of innocence or call evidence known to be false, is now established in the Code of Conduct of the Bar of England and Wales and in the associated guidance. Its origins lie, at least in part, in the furious professional argument that followed Courvoisier's execution and his public naming of Phillips as having known of his guilt. Chapter 20. what the Courvoisier case means. François Benjamin Courvoisier was hanged on July 6, 1840, at Newgate Prison, before a crowd of tens of thousands, watched by two men who would become among the most important English novelists of the century, and his death provoked a reflection on the morality of public execution that contributed eventually to its abolition. His trial forced the English legal profession to confront, for the first time in a sustained and public way, the ethics of criminal defense in the most difficult possible circumstances. And the crime for which he was executed, the murder of an elderly aristocrat in his bed, illuminated the tensions of the master-servant relationship and the dangers of the social arrangements that Victorian England had constructed with such confidence and maintained with such relative incuriosity. The case is, at its most basic level, a story of a murder committed for essentially ordinary reasons. Courvoisier was stealing from his employer. He feared discovery. He killed to prevent it. The motive was not extraordinary. The method was direct and brutal, and the consequences for him were absolute. In this sense, the case fits into a long tradition of domestic homicides in which the vulnerability of the servant's position within the household and the asymmetric power of the master-servant relationship combined to create the conditions for violence. But the case is also, and simultaneously, a story about institutions and about the people who operate within them. The legal institution of the bar was confronted, through the figure of Charles Phillips, with a question about the nature and the limits of its obligations that it could not avoid. The institution of public execution was confronted, through the writings of Thackeray and Dickens, with a question about its moral character and social effects that it would take nearly 3 more decades to answer. The institution of domestic service was confronted, through the figure of Courvoisier, with a question about the structural tensions it created and the risks those tensions generated. None of these institutions responded immediately or entirely adequately to the questions that the case posed. The legal profession took decades to work out formal rules that addressed the situation Phillips had faced. Public executions continued for another 28 years after Courvoisier's death. The institution of domestic service continued more or less unchanged until the social upheavals of the early 20th century transformed it beyond recognition. But in each case, the Courvoisier case was part of the evidence from which subsequent generations built their understanding of what the institution in question was doing, and what it should, in justice, do differently. Lord William Russell, whose death is the nominal center of the entire story, is perhaps the figure who receives the least attention in the case's long afterlife, and this is an imbalance worth acknowledging. He was 73 years old. He had lived a full and comfortable life, and he was murdered in his bed by a servant he had trusted. The violence done to him was extreme, and his death was the predicate for everything that followed. He deserves to be remembered not only as the victim who generated the legal and ethical dramas that make the case historically significant, but as a person whose life and death are, in their own right, part of the human record of what happened. The Courvoisier case is, in the end, one of those cases that is significant not because it is dramatically unusual, not because the crime was particularly complex or the legal issues particularly novel, but because the intersection of particularly novel people, particular institutions, and particular historical moments produced a clarity about things that had previously been obscure. The ethics of criminal defense, the morality of public execution, the structural tensions of domestic service, the reliability of circumstantial evidence, these were all things that existed before Courvoisier, but they were all things that the Courvoisier case illuminated in a way that the period had not previously seen. That is, perhaps, what the best criminal cases do. Not the cases that are most dramatic, not the cases that involve the greatest cleverness or the most extraordinary facts, but the cases that happen at the right moment to illuminate things that need illuminating, to force questions that need asking, and to generate the kind of public and professional attention that produces, eventually, change. The Courvoisier case was one of those cases, and that is why, nearly 2 centuries after an elderly aristocrat was found dead in his Park Lane bedroom on a spring morning in 1840, we are still talking about it. This has been the story of Thomas Courvoisier, of Lord William Russell, of Charles Phillips, and of the questions that their encounter raised, and that the law, the profession, and the society of Victorian England spent many years attempting to answer. Thank you for listening.